Welcome to Conext 2022, the annual gathering of Digital Council Africa members, partners, and stakeholders. This year is iconic Cape Town, South Africa. The Digital Council embraces the extraordinary possibilities that the digital economy holds for the African continent. The Digital Council Africa's members have one thing in common. We believe that digital transformation is about putting people first. To our sponsors and partners, thank you for participating. Is a panel discussion on connecting a continent with the focus on Africa's Global Cross Connect Hub.
Well, good afternoon, colleagues and friends. My name is Ntabi Mukitimidlamene, and I am responsible for Nokia's field marketing within the Sub-Saharan Africa region, as well as the Vodacom Group account in Middle Eastern Africa. It's an absolute pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to be with you here today on the very first panel discussion in the fiber stream. Allow me to just take a few minutes to introduce our speakers for today. On my, is it left or right?
Normally left.
Is it normally left? My other right. On my other right is Mr. Ryan Shea. He is the Chief Operating Officer of WIOC. He joined the company in 2009 after a very illustrious career, having held several leadership roles over 8 years in Reliance Global Com. As a CEO, Ryan is responsible for global non-shareholder sales, developing and managing of the company's product offerings, as well as network operations and procurement. In the other right is Mr. Pranesh Parayachi, who is the Group Chief Digital Officer for CCOM. Pranesh has been at the forefront of telecoms technology and has shaped the technology landscape for some of the leading telcos on the continent. With close to 30 years of experience in telecoms, Pranesh has serviced major verticals across the continent, including having established and run his own business. Our last speaker, who has been keeping me on my toes, I said to her, Dr. Thomas, please be lenient on me. She said, no, we need to stimulate the discussion. So we have Dr. Ross Thomas, who is the Managing Director of SAX International Management Limited and the CEO of its subsidiary in South Africa. Dr. Thomas has over 25 years' experience in development finance and infrastructure across the continent. She has held senior roles as a senior executive and advisor. She was the very first African and second woman on the Worldwide Technology Advisory Panel of the World Bank's Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility. Welcome, colleagues.
Thank you.
Well, colleagues, this session will consider the current state of the submarine cable connectivity on the African coast, whether there is enough or adequate connectivity available, the maturity of the submarine markets, and possible future trends in the subsea cable industry. As of 2022, there are 486 cable systems and 1,306 global landings globally. Most of the new cable systems entered into service within just the past 6 years, with a combined construction cost of $12 billion. Investment is expected to continue across all global routes, with planned new cable investment estimated to exceed $10 billion from 2022 to 2024. Now, let me bring all of that closer to home, Dr. Thomas, and pose some of my very first questions to you looking at the African continent. It says this panel refers to Africa's Global Cross Connect Hub. How true a description is that for South Africa at the present moment?
Tavi, if I may, can you hear me? Yeah. If I may, I'd like to ask if they could put a slides thing, because I think it's important for me to talk to that. And I'm going to probably need to, I'm not sure if they can see
Colleagues
it.
at the back, can you please put up the slide?
And can we see it up on here so I can?
Could we have the presentation from Dr. Thomas to project here? Thank you very much. Juanita promised to do the Pansula dance if things like this happen during our session, so I think this would be a right time. Sorry for that, colleagues. We'll be back in a few seconds.
Okay, thank you. If everybody can see that, I think it's important to point out that the title of this panel session is not quite correct. Africa is not a global connect hub, and certainly not South Africa. When you look at this, you'll see that the world connects from east to west. Majority of the traffic is going from the United States to Asia and vice versa, or between the US and Latin America. And when you look at the central circle that I have circled there, that's Africa and Europe. And that's how Africa connects. It connects via Europe for all data currently. And this, with small exceptions, of course. And when you look at the two boxes on the left, on the right-hand side, the cities that are hubs are at the top in Europe, North America, and in Asia. And those are Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam in Europe. North America, it's New York, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Dallas, Miami, and in Asia, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore. South Africa, in particular, is at the edge. It's an edge location. And therefore, the table at the bottom shows where South Africa, or Johannesburg in particular, which is the regional hub, is located in terms of growth and development. And effectively, it's seen as, this is telegeography's data as well. It's a little bit dated, but essentially, what it is Johannesburg is a low-growth edge location, and it needs to actually be stimulated more effectively. And I'll point out, so that the important thing is, and this is the fact number one that I showed. Fact number two is that where is Africa's digital content coming from? Majority, where are most Africans looking for digital content? And if you look at the orange bar that has been circled, 56% of Africans want American content, but they're being served from Europe. And if you look at the European content, which is a little blue bar, that's 32% of European content, okay? And a smaller percentage, 12%, is Asian. So effectively, 56%, majority of Africans want American content. But again, like I said, they've been served from Europe. And when you look at that, in the context of, this shows you how the cables are built. Cables are all serving Africa from Europe, whether it's London or whether it's coming from Marseille or from Portugal. And that includes the two OTT mega projects, to Africa and Equiano. And consequently, what is South Africa? It's a terminus. It's the end point for all these cables, okay? Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem we have in South Africa. It means that we've got very high latency. So many people will remember when they're looking or trying to downstream or download video and they want to download gaming or whatever, there's buffering continuously because it's very slow delivery. Because we're looking at 236 milliseconds when it comes from the United States across the North Atlantic and then across all these systems down to Africa. And about 190 milliseconds if we come on SACS via Miami and Monet, okay? So essentially, that picture on the left shows you what's happening. And you can see all the latencies in that slide. I'm not going to go on that. I'm just telling a story. The fourth fact that I want to point out is that all these cables traverse the same routing. They all go through Mediterranean, through the Egypt, the Gulf of Aden, around the Gulf, the Horn of Africa to come down to Africa or go Asia, and essentially going through very high risky areas in terms of either geology or man-made issues, which always means that all those cables going there face the same risks. If one gets cut, several get cut, whether it's going to be fishing, anchors, or whatever. And getting them fixed is going to be also a problem. I've put in our system that we're planning, which is an east-west system, and therefore is actually diverse, and is an all-wet system, and avoids all those choke points that we've indicated. If you look at SAIX East and SAIX West that we're planning to build, and hope to reach financial close on SAIX East in next year. This is what our system looks like. It's different. It's diverse, it's all wet, and it's connecting the largest digital economies to Africa, where Africa is the focal point or the center. And consequently, what we're hoping to achieve by connecting is also setting out true cross-connects and halving the latencies between the United States and South Africa, and between Singapore and South Africa. That's my answer for you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for that detailed answer. And I'll come back to, I think you touched a very important point around the OTTs, and I'll come back to that one. But okay. I'm just going to ask Ryan, let me move to you. Submarine cables. We all know that they've been engineered to have a minimum design life of 25 years. But if the costs of operating a cable exceed their revenues, and they continually exceed these revenues, an operator may consider retiring that cable. Do you think it's true that some cables' economic life may be shorter due to the viability of operating such cables?
Yeah, so my view on this is you've got to look at each system individually and consider the question. So technically, most subsea cables, or in fact, probably all of them, are designed for a minimum of 25 years life. So technically, the actual fiber and the repeaters and all the components are engineered for that sort of span. Practically, though, and commercially, what we see is new generations of cables have a lot more capacity than the old ones. So at some point, the cost of running two systems, clearly, if the new system is 50 times greater capacity than the old system, then the question becomes very pertinent about, can you afford to keep both systems running? And that's where you kind of have to get into the nuances of each cable system in each part of the world and the geographies. So in Africa, this is obviously a very pertinent question now, because you've got Equiano and 2 Africa coming, which are very high capacity systems, probably close on 20 times the available capacity of the existing systems. So what happens to our existing systems around Africa? And if you look through maybe the history, I actually looked up one fact today, just one, which was SAT3 went live in 2002. So it's been going for 20 years now. So there's a system where we know the operational cost of the system is a lot higher than replacing all the capacity on the system with, let's say, WAX on the West Coast versus SAT3 on the West Coast. You could buy 100 gigabytes on WAX for less cost than almost, running way more running the whole system on SAT3. So why is that system still in service? And I think the answer is you've got multiple countries. SAT3 connects countries where this is one of the only connections into those countries. So those smaller countries don't have the options to flip over to other cables. There needs to be a level of diversity maintained between all these cable systems. And diversity is obviously critical going forward. You can't have, even if you've got these 2 new massive cables, is that enough? So in each case, you'll consider the kind of the economics, the reach, And then it flows from there. So if, let's say on SAT3, some of the larger players move to AX or Equiano to Africa, the smaller players are going to be the ones that are hurt. So operators like Equiano only go South Africa, Nigeria, Portugal. So the operators who are in Nigeria and South Africa can leave SAT3 or WAX, replace it. But that will leave a huge funding gap in SAT3, and that puts SAT3 at risk. On the East Coast, we've got other issues. So like on the Easy Cable system, it doesn't go all the way to Europe. It stops in Djibouti, and then it connects onto a second cable. While 2Africa's end-to-end, it goes straight from Africa all the way to Europe. So you don't have the double economics of having to pay for two cables. You also have a problem with the interconnect costs. In countries, the old system have a kind of a toll gate where you have to pay to get on the on-ramp of the cable, and that also adds to the economic stability of the cable, because now it's not just the O&M you're paying your toll to the landing provider to access the cable system. So at some point, you go, all right, the math doesn't work anymore, we're going to flip it over to Africa, unless there's enough countries and customers who need the diversity. And I think there will be for some time. And when it comes to the cloud operators, the cloud guys are looking for 3-4 cables minimum to run a cloud center. They won't enter a country that doesn't have 4 diverse routes, maybe 3 for some of them. So that's going to prolong the system life as well. So yeah, so in other words, we'll see how it plays out. It's going to be a very interesting time for WAX, for SAT3, and for Easy over the next 5 years, I think.
And I think you spoke about something very important, the economics. But before we go into that, do you think there is a need for all this capacity?
So yes, the short answer is yes. You often hear that question, these cable systems are so big, what are we going to do with that capacity? To me, it's like Moore's law in terms of capacity. Capacity just keeps growing. No matter how much you have, you can never have enough. I don't know anybody here who would say they don't want a bigger home connection. Technology is evolving, 5G, Internet of Things. There's going to be lots of demand drivers for capacity. So my personal view is these new systems are not big enough and not enough for Africa's needs. And there's another change with the new systems versus the old systems, technology change, which is the old systems, the capacity they were designed for originally and the capacity they are now, there's about 100-fold, even more, increase in design capacity over the life of the system. As technologies improved and you can do more wavelengths at a higher bandwidth over these cables, I think operators are used to getting more capacity out of their system in masses of orders of magnitude. But the new cables, we're starting to hit a threshold where, this is beyond my technical understanding, but something called the Shannon limit, where you can't squeeze much more. The physics don't allow you to squeeze much more capacity out of the systems. So the new systems are not going to go from 12, 13 terabits where they are today per fiber pair to 1,000 terabits. It's not going to work like that. They may increase by 1.5 or double. And that means that the only way to replace this capacity is to build new systems. And at $1 billion plus to go around Africa, that's going to take time. So I think practically what's going to happen is there will be a glut of capacity in the beginning, or operators will think that there's so much capacity, and that will probably flood into the market. But over the next few years, I think operators will realize that actually there isn't much capacity. Also, the new systems are much more consolidated around mobile players and content providers who are using that capacity for their own use. That means what's wholesaling out in the market is much smaller. So in fact, if you take all these systems and you break it down to what's available for everybody else, it's not massive. Yeah. And a little bit of mass with the growth rate, at WIOC, I think we're at like 2 terabits. A full fiber system is about 13 terabits. If you're growing at 1.3 to 1.5 times a year in capacity growth, which is about average for the internet in Africa, it doesn't take long to get over 13 terabits for fiber pair. So that's the math. The maths, in my view, I think we need more fiber and more cables.
Thank you. I think you raised very pertinent points, Ryan, and I'm just interested to get your perspective, Pranesh, on what Ryan has just said.
Yeah, so when you look at these cables, and you look at the CCOM cable, you pretty much determine the economics of this upfront in any event. You do a whole bunch of capacity planning, and you build according to the technology that's available. If you look at, and similar to what Ryan was saying, if you look at this and then understand how technology has evolved, in the early days of cable and when SAT3 went live, to get a sort of 100 gig interface on SAT3 was impossible. You would get multiple 64Ks, and that's what SAT3 started off with. Today, you don't hear of a 64K line to anyone's home. You'll hear of a minimum 100 meg line to people's homes. I suppose the other factor that's important in this is when the original cables were built, they were built for transmission capacity. So pretty much you bought a transmission link, and that transmission link was what was allocated to you, whether you used it or not, and that's what consumed cables over for a long period of time. If you then translate that back into what cables are used for today, and by and large most subsea cables today are used for internet access, which then starts to talk about an overbooking ratio for internet access. So you don't typically sell internet access at 1-to-1. If you look at global internet access trends, you sit between 2 and 3-to-1. It's an overbooking ratio. So that changes the dynamic of how much of capacity you actually need, because not everyone's using the cable at the same time, and you're not nailing up the capacity for that. The other part that I think is important, and further to what Ryan was saying, there will be countries in Africa for a long time that won't be connected by these larger cable systems. The other part to bear in mind is for those particular countries, the socio-economic sort of issues in those countries, internet is not the biggest thing for them. Internet's a great enabler for them, but they've got other issues to solve. So they're not going to wake up tomorrow and get 100 meg to their home and start to use 100 gigs of capacity to the internet. So these things start to take time and evolve. But I think with these other cables coming on board, and I think we'll start to get to that sort of inflection point. Lots of the capacity we see today is trying to get to the OTTs and download content, the YouTube videos and all those. The OTTs are starting to bring their clusters into the country, and the content starts to sit locally. Then you start to look at this and you work out the economics of that. Do you really need the capacity to go to Europe, or is the content coming here? I think it'll take some time to get there, but if you speak to every one of the OTTs, every one of them has a plan to come to Africa. Every one of them talk about the next billion for them to connect is in Africa. So it would make sense for them to come here. And then that, I suppose, will then compound into where is that point that we have sufficient capacity or not. I do agree. I don't think like 13 or 20 terabits is going to be enough, and I think people will find different uses for it, and more content will be created off the continent than there is today. But I also think people are starting to localize as well. If you look at the local movie industries that you have in various sectors across Africa, they're creating content locally, they store the content locally, they consume the content locally. The other part, I suppose, that plays very well into the subsea connectivity is how do you then get that connectivity from your cable landing station and other places to places that it really needs to go to? Because that's just solving one part of the problem. So if we don't couple the connectivity or the subsea capacity that's landing on the continent with sufficient reliable terrestrial connectivity, then we've got a totally different problem that we need to handle. Other areas for me that I suppose when it comes to the economics of subsea cables, for pretty much every subsea cable that's gone live, the first 12 to 14 months of it are problematic while the cable stabilizes, and you can test as much as you want to in a lab from a branching unit or a repeater or anything like that. But the subsea conditions are totally different to what you can create in the lab. So lots of these cables, you'll find that the first 12 or 14 months for them are problematic. And you need to work through those things, and you need to be able to build sufficient, I suppose, redundancy into that to make sure it does last. And then the third, or suppose the fourth aspect to that is diversity is always going to be something and a requirement that's, whichever country you're in, whichever continent you're in, diversity is going to be an important factor. And I think that's where these other cables come into their own for. They may have smaller capacities, but they definitely give you diversity. And they also give you the fact that it is a cable system that's been around for some time, it has stabilized, the reality of something going wrong sort of post-its, whether it's been in existence for 10 years or so, will be something that would be difficult, and history has shown that as well. You know, when the SAT2 cable was live in South Africa, that cable was extended a number of times, and capacity was increased a number of times as well. So history shows that these cables do last a long time, and I think that's what we need to take into account.
Thank you very much, Pranesh. I think the panelists have given us some great thought starters and jogged our memories. I will just to conclude, I'm going to circle back to you, Dr. Thomas. We spoke a bit about the OTTs. What should we be learning from the OTTs around the strategic vision for Africa?
Okay, before I get to answer that, I just want to pick up couple of the points that both speakers mentioned. First of all, with Ryan, the issue about the retirement of older cables. I think safe cable is a case in point. That cable is going to be probably, it's already obsolete. I think its total capacity is about 450 gigs. And it's probably going to be decommissioned in 2025, 2026. And that's where our system would hopefully be able to migrate that traffic onto the SIAC system. But essentially also, I think the point that has been made by Pranesh is also important, and I think Ryan has picked that up too as well, that, you know, the need to actually, all of these cables coming in will have an impact on the continent. Whether we like it or not, it's going to have an impact. And it's going to actually stimulate the local providers, the fiber providers, the metro providers. They have to do something with all that capacity landing. Otherwise, you don't use it, you lose it. Somebody else is going to come up and be competing with you and actually doing you out of business and pushing prices down. And there's nothing wrong with prices going down, because what it does is it creates economies of scale and it then allows us to reach those populations that are not connected. But again, the challenge for Africa, and this is the point that Pranesh is making, is that there are a lot of countries that are not connected, or if very small connected, and their biggest problems are access to water, access to electricity, and other kinds of issues which they need to address as well. And in a sense, stimulating digital connectivity actually will help drive economic activity that actually may solve those other problems too. And those are things that we need to think about more, I think, out of the box than we are doing at the moment when it comes to that. And with that point, I think it's important for me to put up the next number of slides, which I will talk to and answer your questions on what are the OTTs seeing, that in many ways, a lot of the carriers in Africa are not. And this is, I think, if I would ask yes, please, thank you. You'll see from this table that this one shows that effectively, you know, Africa has, when you look at 2017, this is the point that was made this morning by the lady from ITU, that 22%, this table says 22%, she said 23. 22% of Africans are connected to the internet. And that compared to all the other countries, I think if you look at this table shows you where we sit. And yet, this is what's happening. We've got Equiano cable, and we've got To Africa coming in on stream soon. Equiano's already landed in South Africa. And these cables, what are these OTTs seeing? They're seeing that, again, the ITU mentioned 740 million people unconnected. My statistics taken from our IFC report, Google, which is sponsored by Google in 2020, 2021, is 840 million people. So it seems like 1% or 100 million have actually been connected in this period that this study has been done. So what are they seeing? They're seeing an opportunity. This map shows you from unconnected populations 2022 thing that I'm sorry, I can't see this slides too well, but I do have it here, but essentially. I want to give some numbers. If we're looking at East Africa, 341 million people are not connected. And if we look at Northern Africa, 92 million. West Africa, 241 million people. Southern Africa, 23 million people not connected. And in Central Africa, 142 million people. Total being about 840 or 740 million, whoever statistics you're going to believe. So that's an opportunity that the OTTs are seeing. It's a youth on the continent that they are seeing. They're seeing people, not just money only, but from that, money will come because they want eyeballs on their platforms. And if you look at connectiveness, that DHL's global connectiveness rankings, where Netherlands is number 1 and Singapore number 2, Mauritius is 48th on that ranking, South Africa 57, and then the rest of the region of the continent, Nigeria is 112. This is out of 169 countries, okay? Zambia, 128, and if you go to the last group, you find that Burundi is the 169th country. So we are not as connected as we should be, and this is showing you that as well. But that's an opportunity for these OTTs. And why do I say that? If you look at that circle right at the end, that is showing you that South Africa and South Africans are the highest in terms of daily time spent using the internet. 10.46 hours, South Africans. That is South Africans. They spend 10.46 hours per day on the internet. And that's, when you're looking at the others, the median is somewhere like in the middle there, the white bar. And this one shows you digital content purchasing. Despite the 23% or 22% that are connected, the yellow circle shows you that the highest spenders globally, Nigeria and Kenya sit there. And the white circle, South Africans are below the median. That's South Africa. That's in terms of digital spend. And this is where it's on, in terms of, this is a 293.9 billion per annum spend based on video games, video on demand, publishing, or whatever, okay? So essentially, what they're also seeing, and this is coming out of the IFC's Google study, is that we're a population of 1.3 billion, which is set to grow to 2.5 billion by 2050. And essentially, in the total continent, we only have 700,000 talented program developers. And this talks to this morning's presentation also on the skills issues in Africa, okay? But if you're looking at, for example, where is the number 1 country for, and this is the whole continent, 700,000 people who are developing apps. If you look at the number 1 country in the world, it's India, and the one town in India is Bangalore. There's over 400 and something thousand program developers sitting in Bangalore. But we have 700,000 total, and in South Africa, the number is about 56,000. So we're on the edge. We're not even part of the hub developers. But more importantly, what they see is huge financial benefits from the submarine cables coming down. In 2019, submarine cables stimulated $115 billion in Africa. They estimate $180 billion by 2025, and by 2050, $712 billion in income and revenues developed. So essentially, and this is just based on their projections based on Equiano. It's not looking at any other cables. Can you imagine what's possible for African continent with all the connectivity as well as new cables coming on board? And Ryan is right. The demand is just going to grow. And so essentially, with formal unemployment in South Africa at about 35%, and with youth unemployment more than 65%, this is an important statistic. And the issue that we have to remember is that Google and Facebook and Meta, at least Facebook Meta, see the opportunity, and they're grabbing it. We need to be also thinking about that, and our leaders need to be thinking about that, and ourselves. How do we also take advantage of this growth, not just leave it to go off the continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. We really need to take advantage. I'd like to take a few questions from the floor. I'm not sure if we've got any microphones. I've got a question here from Luvo.
Thank you very much, Tabi. My question is to Mr. Padiachi. My name is Luvo Gray. I am the Managing Director of ESA Internet, a digital infrastructure specialist company and an internet service provider in the Eastern Cape. So my question is, a couple of years ago, we were earmarked as East London as one of the, the cities in South Africa which the IOX undersea cable was going to land, right? And surprisingly, a few months later, we heard that it's now moved to Durban, right? So my question is, what is the criteria that undersea cable companies use to, for a cable to land in that particular city? The reason I ask this is because of the economic spin-offs that come from, a cable landing in your city, understanding the unemployment challenges that we have in the Eastern Cape, right? So I want to understand how can we position ourselves as the Eastern Cape for undersea cables to land there? Thank you very much.
So I think it comes through to the point I made earlier on. The ability to get the content off the cable to where it needs to go to. So any area that a cable lands in, part of the criteria is, does it have sufficient terrestrial connectivity to get that content to where it needs to go to? The difficult part about it is the infrastructure available. So some of the countries that, and this was specific when the CCOM cable landed, the CCOM cable landed in countries there was no connectivity previously. So in certain instances, you have to hedge your bets as to where the best place is to do that. When you look at South Africa particularly, you'll find that if you have sufficient backhaul and terrestrial capacity, it makes it a much more lucrative destination for you to land the cable or not. Other areas to consider, I suppose, in that is when you are laying the cable, is it a feasible option to lay the cable? You need to look at sort of terrestrial or not terrestrial, sort of subsea shelves. Where do you lay the cable and the likes? And then the other area that does become important, you'll have to go through EIAs and the likes. So all of those play a factor in it. But I suppose the key one is there sufficient, and specifically in countries like South Africa where we have large amounts of terrestrial infrastructure, is there sufficient terrestrial infrastructure to backhaul the capacity when it hits land in that particular region?
Just to add, Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, I just wanted to correct the gentleman who I raised the question. The Indian Ocean Express, or IOX cable, is not in existence. The cable that landed at Amanzimtoti in Durban, or 20 kilometers south of Durban, is Metis cable. Metis cable comes from the Indian Ocean Islands, from Mauritius, Reunion, Madagascar, and lands at, it's a sub-regional cable, in other words. Whereas IOX was planned and did not come through. It was supposed to have gone from India through to Mauritius and come to, actually to meet what was formerly called by the Seabras American cable. They were thinking of Sabra, South Africa to Brazil. And they were going to land IOX, or connect to IOX in Cape Town. But IOX it doesn't exist. It's Metis cable, and it's a regional or sub-regional cable that comes from the Indian Ocean Islands to Durban. But our cable, to answer you, will land in Cape Town, because Cape Town will be the main connecting point for SAIX East and SAIX West, but we do and will have a landing also at Amanzimtoti, close to Durban.
Yes. And I think his question was also around what is the criteria used to decide where the cable is landed. Would you be able to?
Yeah, it depends on what your business plan is. I mean, for example, our system, we have two plans. We have two justifications for our business plan, and that is, one is we want to connect South Africa as a diverse, because all traffic comes north-south. We want to connect east-west, because essentially, that is missing at the moment. The only cable that exists is SAFE, so we want to replace that. But more importantly, is we are looking at the issue of providing diversity, transit traffic for east-west traffic that is looking for alternatives to the routes going north through the Mediterranean or across the Pacific, which is also a high-risk area geologically because of all the earthquakes and volcanoes that are under the Pacific Ocean that also cause problems for cables. So we're looking at diversity. We may not be the main cable, but we will provide strategic diversity for a lot of parties that want that, because most network planners are looking for diversity, and they want to have at least 3 or 4 other cables and solutions, and we would provide that with an all-wet system. But more importantly also is the second point, is we would like to connect Africa also to Asia. And that's why Amanzimtoti becomes an important landing point to get into Africa for Asian traffic. But if you're connecting to the United States and to Brazil, which we are looking at, then Cape Town is an important landing point, especially for traffic that wants to come into Africa via the regional hub South Africa.
Thank you.
Let me just, so Dr. Thomas, maybe
just finish before you go. Sorry.
I think
Can we just give Ryan?
Okay.
Ryan.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say, we're actually landing to Africa in Amanzimtoti at the moment. So practically, you need a place to enter South Africa that's as close to the rest of the East Coast as possible, and that's pretty close. Then my next point is, why do you care if there's a cable landing directly in the Eastern Cape? I don't think it's not a direct benefit. You mentioned the word community and the economics. It's an indirect benefit, because once the cable, if Johannesburg had a sea, it would be landing in Johannesburg, right? The content needs to get to where the majority of the users and eyeballs are, and then Pranesh's point, you can then distribute it to other parts of the country. So it's a practical issue. It's a cost issue. Every kilometer of cable costs money. And then obviously where cables land, where there's existing cables, you've got landing stations, you've got infrastructure, you've got no anchorage zones. There's a lot of kind of economies of scale of reusing similar areas. That's my only comment.
Answered.
Just a quick one for you, Dr. Thomas. So I think to help with the question, when you were planning the both East and West cable, did you look at the Eastern Cape for somewhere to land it, as somewhere that you would land the cable?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question.
So when you were planning your East and West cable,
Yes.
did you look at the Eastern Cape to land it?
What we did was we looked at, connecting the two systems. And for us, it was not only connecting to create the transit traffic route, but also to get into Africa and to serve the markets in Africa, and specifically Southern Africa and East Africa. That's what we looked at Amanzimtoti.
I'm just going to take one last question before we do our closing remarks. Is there any other question? No. That's
Okay,
how
but
clear
just
you are.
on one other point that I think is important as well, that we need to, so when somebody asks, what do we look at? The other concern that is most cables, and these are the legacy cables, land at Mzanzini. So Amanzimtoti also became an important diversity landing to protect cables from being in any single point of failure. If you all land at Mzanzini and there's a tsunami that just comes in and wipes out the cable landing station, we cut. So we need to also have diversity. So yes, we can land in Durban, but we will also land in Cape Town, we'll land in different places. And I think to Africa is also looking at East London or Port Elizabeth.
To Africa lands in Port Elizabeth and Cape
so
Town. And
essentially, this allows also for not having one single point of failure.
I think we are reaching the end of our allocated time, and I'm just going to give about 2 minutes for our panelists to give us the concluding remarks, starting with yourself, Ryan.
Okay, so I think where we are now in this, this connected world and Africa's place in it. I saw Rosa's slides in the beginning. I do think actually South Africa is a hub. It's a regional hub. It's a regional hub. The content players are coming here, and they want to come here because there's multiple cable systems, diversity, and a competitive environment with good regulators. So you have a competitive, fair market with diversity. And I think that's a good example that the rest of Africa can follow. I think you want as many cables landing in your country as possible. You want to have regulation being an enabler, not a prohibitor of cables. And then as soon as you have the ecosystems building around the cable systems and the data centers, then the cloud guys are going to come and put the content there. So you don't have to go to Europe and you don't have to go to the US to get it. It's going to come here and to the rest of Africa. So I think over time you'll see some regional hubs develop: South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, West Africa, South Africa, SADC, and Kenya for East Africa. And there'll be different, the internet will kind of sprawl out in a different way to the way it has over the last 10 or 15 years, where everybody wanted to go to Europe to get the internet. The
So there
internet's
is
coming
great
out.
opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Pranesh?
Yes, so I suppose in closing is do we need more capacity in Africa? Yes, we do. Should more cables be coming in? Yes, they should be. Where should they land? I think that's purely determined by the socio-economic conditions in that country. I also do think that at some point the OTTs will bring the content to us rather than us fetching it. And I think we need to be careful and wary about that, because we don't want to be over-investing as well in these sectors. Important factors there. To Ryan's point as well, regulation needs to be an enabler rather than an inhibitor to any of this. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact when subsea cables first came to anywhere in the world, they came in for a particular purpose, and that was to deliver voice services. Today, cables come to many countries and many continents to deliver internet services to consumers as well as businesses. But consumers will become the largest consumptions of those cable systems. So we need to be wary of that, and we need to understand the trends of the end user and why they actually use these cables today, be it to buy things online, to transact online, to search content online, to do schoolwork online, whatever it is. And that's where we start to need to look at these things. The other important factor, and I've seen this over the many years that I've been in this industry, and I was actually relating the story to someone the other day. I remember the days when South Africa had a 64K line to the internet. And if you start to look at these things, and in the early days of the internet in South Africa, the video content was difficult, because the codecs in video content was so bandwidth hungry that you needed large bandwidth. Today you can quite easily watch an HD video on a 6 megabit line. And that's the big difference. So you start to look at these things. And, I chat to many people today that have a 100 meg link to their home, or some of them that have a 1 gig link to their home. But if you really look at what they use on those links to their home today, do they really use 100 meg? Yes, maybe some points in the day they do, or some points in the month. But not everyone uses it. So I think we need to start to look at those things. Because content does come closer to us, it starts to make a difference into what we actually need. But overarching factor, yes, we do need more bandwidth in the country, we do need more cables, and we need to have regulation that enables that.
Thank you very much, Pranesh. Your thoughts, Dr. Thomas?
I need to be a little bit more challenging on these two guys. Really, I think both Ryan and Pranesh are looking at the old view of what is possible in South Africa and in Africa. My view is, when you look at the continent, when you look at where South Africa is positioned, South Africa is positioned at the base of the continent. It's at the confluence of two major oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And it also at the confluence of two major hemispheres, East and West. It's a strategic location, but we're not using it. Ooh, is this my? I'm not sure. We're not using that location effectively. Yes, we are a regional hub. We are a regional hub, but we can be a global hub. The only other country that has a similar kind of location is Singapore. Singapore sits at the confluence of the East and the West. And look where it is. It's number 2 for connectivity. Why can't we have an ambition to be another Singapore? Why do we want to stay an edge location? And why do we want to say, okay, we're okay with the latency we receive if we are served from Europe, and okay, the OTTs will come here. But remember, a lot of the data center operators that have got local hosting of cloud are saying they cannot host all of the content they would like to because of latency issues. Currently, when you are being served from Europe, whether it's from London or from Portugal or wherever in Europe, we are dealing with latencies of between 170, 190, and 236 milliseconds. Our system will halve that to 135 milliseconds. So we're looking at actually being able to become, and this is the ambition that I know, I've had a conversation with the Department of Trade and Industry about this. They want to attract hyperscale data centers. We're not going to be attracting the hyperscale data centers with our systems that have latency issues and not able to get out-of-country hosting of cloud. And we have to think about things like also artificial intelligence and all the other programs or platforms that are going to be developing. Will we always want to be at the edge? We need to be thinking more strategically. We need to be thinking about this country actually become a destination for hyperscalers. Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly great insights offered by our panelists, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank them. I think beyond this session, we will have more discussions around some of these issues. So thank you very much, and thank you to you. We are at the end of the session.
To our sponsors and partners, thank you for participating.